Hello everyone, this is Tara at Omnitrax welcoming you to today's webinar on the key things you should know about the electronic logging device mandate. A few quick items before we get started. You've joined in a listen-only conference mode. Please use the chat box to communicate with us in WebEx. Following today's presentation is a live Q&A, so please type your questions into chat throughout the webinar. Also, we are recording this webinar and will provide it after the event. Joining us today is Tom Cuthbertson. Tom is VP of Regulatory Compliance at Omnitrax and has been in the industry for 25 years as both a carrier and supplier. Tom has been involved with regulatory issues since 1996, and he works closely with FMCSA and CVSA Driver Traffic Safety Committee. He is currently chairman of the ATA Technology and Maintenance Council, ELD, and Connect the Vehicle Task Forces. Tom is a recipient of 2 awards for contributions to industry technology. He is also a co-inventor with 2 patents on driver and vehicle performance. Tom, we're very glad to have you here today, so let's begin.
Well, thanks so much. Some of the webinar, this is the agenda that we're going to cover today. Some of it will be very similar to things that we talked about in January, and we've added some things. And I think what will be a help is that we put some glossaries in on acronyms that too many times, cause confusion on what do all these things mean. So we're going to do a little bit on the current timeline. It's remained the same, which is a change. We're going to overview some of the key notables in this supplemental notice over proposed rulemaking, and I want to remind people that this is a supplemental notice and this is not the final rule, but there's many things in here that I think when we bring them up we want to take note. We'll look at the little bit more expanded information on the transference of log detail, a little more on the security within the SNPRM, and we'll also look at some certification items that have been in ICRs, and what they are is information notifications that FMCSA has a requirement to publish. So just to go over some short glossary information, AOBRD, Automatic Onboard Recording Device, that's the current rulemaking that's in place right now. That's what all of the certified devices that are in the industry fall under, that regulation. DOT, Department of Transportation, and we put an ELD and EOBR in together because that's where we keep naming things different, but trying to confuse people. But ELD, which is under the current mandate, is electronic logging device, and EOBR, electronic onboard recorder, that term came from the 395-16 regulation that was required to be vacated. So going forward, many times we're just going to stick with electronic logging device. FIPS is a security standard, but it's Federal Information Processing Standards. FMCSA, many people know, or Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. A few more of those items would be Hours of Service, HOS, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. The difference here is many times when a rulemaking comes out for the first time, that's the acronym that would be attached to it. NIST is another processing standards and security standards, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that many of the government agencies follow with ensuring that information is protected. PKI is a public key infrastructure, and it's really encryption certificates, and it will be used, we'll talk about it a little more, on how to make sure that information is secure being transferred over wireless technologies. RODS, everybody that's in safety understands that, record of duty status, and again, supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. And the reason that this mandate process is a supplemental notice is because of the vacate due to the court decision. Just to review this again, and it hasn't changed, and typically the significant rulemaking calendar is published right around this time of month, and I verified it just before we got on the call. They had not published May yet, but up through April, the dates really remain the same, and these are the proposed dates within the rulemaking. So an AOBRD, which again is an automatic onboard recorder of the current regulation, that can be installed anytime before the published date. Now, the published date from what we understand in the schedule would be approximately September of 2015. And usually an effective date is 30 days later, which is October. The compliance date is October 2017 under this simulated timeline. And what that means is that the compliance date would be any new device installed in vehicles has to be according to the ELD mandate requirements by that time. And if you haven't installed an ELD prior to that, you would have to install a compliant ELD to the SNPRM, meaning it satisfies all the requirements of that new rulemaking. What's in there right now is, people call it a grandfathering clause. Again, as it stands, it says that the grandfathering clause, or you would be allowed to use an AOBRD up to 2 years after the compliance date, which would be, in our understanding, as this calendar is right now, October of 2019. So what does this address again? And some people may know this, and some people may have not looked enough, but it's going to satisfy an update of technical specifications. Much of this came from the Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committees that we participated in. And in that, it was, at that time, because the 395-16 was there, we called it an EOBR subcommittee. Supporting documents, that's been a problem for some time, and supporting documents would be part of this. And in that, you know, it makes comments like you will have to have up to 10 supporting documents for a 24-hour tour of duty. It has quite a bit of things, and I'll address more, to driver harassment, mandating ELD for drivers that are required to keep records of duty status. It also talks about other exemptions in there. What's not in there, and they were seeking comments, mechanical engines, right? We're looking at people to submit comments, which many suppliers and other people have done because they don't have a good way to satisfy the requirements of the ELD mandate from a mechanical engine. We also requested some comments on carrier transitional operations because same driver may be running an ELD or an AOBRD, and wanted to address that. There is the item where many carriers can run a state rule and a federal rule, or a federal rule and a Canadian rule at the same time. There was no note of the harmonization calculations, but us as suppliers, we're doing that right now. We make sure that the math is correct when you go into Canada and come back out of Canada. We make sure that all the hours of service on on-duty and off-duty are calculated appropriately, but there was no specifications in the supplemental notice. It also really didn't address directly OBD because there are many vehicles out there right now that could qualify to require records of duty status that are lighter vehicles but still pass the 10,000-pound requirement that would require records of duty status. One of the new items are that they do define yard moves, and, you know, talking to customers, this has been concerns at times, but they put in an event status, as they call it, called a yard move. And it would not measure drive time, but it would measure on-duty time. And the driver would put themselves manually into this yard move, and that would satisfy that, and then take them out of a yard move when they begin driving. Now, under the supplemental notice, they defined that drive would start at about 5 miles per hour, not about, up to 5 miles per hour. And when that happens, there's no duration of distance and there's no duration of time. Just when the device senses that you've reached a 5 mile per hour threshold, you would be in drive. There was only one definition, and we put comments in to expand it a little bit, but there was only one definition to allow auto duty status changes, and that was if the vehicle was stopped up to 5 minutes, that you would be able to put the unit into an auto on duty, but because you have situations of stop in traffic, that you would give the driver notification to say, do you want to stay in drive or you want to go into an on-duty status. They've also proposed some items of interoperability, but that was in a discussion, and that was be able to transfer federal rules to dissimilar suppliers or devices. And they really addressed harassment in more detail to give more control to the driver of how edits and things are done. And to cover that a little more, and we've done some of this, I reworded some things since the last time, but it really allows the driver to edit the logs and create annotations for everything except drive time. So drivers are not allowed to do log in, log out, or edit any drive time. Also, if you do apply any edits at the back office, and you're still allowed to do that, but they'd be in a pending status the way it's worded until the driver accepts those back office edits, so that then they would be applied to the log at that time. And some of those, if they're on the fly edits, be cautious of that as you're applying them, because there has to be a point in time when the driver can stop and review these edits, because you can't do them on the fly. Required that drivers have direct access to log information, meaning their suggestion is through the ELD that the driver is able to get information and copies of their logs as they stand within the ELD. They don't define for what length of time, but as many of you know, an ELD and an ELBRD are required if you're in Canada to keep 14 days of logs, and if you're in the United States, under federal rules, you have to have 8 days of log detail. And we ensure that all driver and all edits are applied before, again, detail review. A few other things are personal conveyance, that we do not record any engine information, and that the GPS mile accuracy would be no more refined than 10 miles. Audible muting of device, because that came up big time in an hours of service listening session, so that the driver would not be disturbed in a sleeper berth. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a coercion is prohibited concerns there, that there is a second rulemaking regulation that has to occur with the ELD mandate. And the other thing that it posed was that if there's any unassigned vehicle moves, and all our products do that, catch that they would present it to the driver, and the driver would have the review process to accept or comment on those unassigned vehicle moves before applied. So when we talk about transfer, right, they talked about this transfer, and it's ERODS, Electronic Record of Duty Status. So it's detailed data information about the log for the day and the week, and it would have to be transferred to enforcement on these defined methods in the block, meaning that the way they worded it, web services, Bluetooth, and email file transfer, you would have to pick one of them, and two of either a transfer jet, a QR code, or USB thumb drive. Now, QR codes are quick reference codes that many of you have seen, and I'll expand on that a little bit later. But there's a lot of security wrapped around this to protect the information and have privacy. But this would be the methodologies on the technology employed to transfer this information to roadside enforcement or weigh scale. And as well, the ERODS was defined that if there was an in-house audit, that you would transfer the log detail data via an ERODS file into software. Now, a little bit more on the ERODS. What that would be is all this data would go in there, and the way we understand it is that it would look at violations, look at the detailed information, and basically do something similar to what we do right now in the system. I want to expand a little bit on the QR codes from what we did before to give them a better perspective on some of this. And we don't know if this is going to make it or not in the final rule, but this is some of the complexity. So what we did was I showed one of our products there in a 7-inch tablet, and I tried to do it to best scale. And in the middle of the screen where the log detail is a QR code, and that, by the way, is not at a full density of the capability. If you look on the screen, there's a smaller QR code next to the scanner. That's the size of the QR code density that you typically see when you're seeing ads or you're seeing information like that, that may be a QR code that's only 50, 70, 100 characters. And the QR code represented is only shown 1250. So the capability is twice as dense. Now, when you get density that high, they put a funding line, I think, for $10 million for enforcement to get scanners. And that kind of QR code really can't be done well by an infrared scanner. It needs a digital scanner or a photo scanner. So that would be represented on the screen. And if you happen to be a pretty nonstop LTL carrier, private fleet, meaning a lot of stops, and it's not inconceivable to have 25 or 30 duty status changes in a day, depending on, what your routes are, then you could have somewhere between 8, meaning 1 QR code per day, and up to XX QR codes, meaning maybe 20, maybe 16, maybe more, because of the length of the record and the information you have to capture. So that would have to be transferred either USB or Bluetooth or email transfer to enforcement at Roadside. But you can see from this some of the complexity here that would be involved for Roadside transfer of this type of information. And then I want to get into transfer methods and security. When you look at some of this, there's also transfer jet. What that is near field communications. It's really a bump technology that many people have on their smartphones, whether they're iPhones or their Androids. It's a way at a very close proximity that you need to do this. So let me hit this call-out box a little bit. So AES 256 is an advanced encryption standard that has to be applied, and it's defined within NIST and the FIPS items. So it requires a very dense key, meaning 256 bits. So that's a lot of encryption to protect data. And it's defined in the NIST and the FIPS standards. So the USB thumb drive would need to be capable of this AES 256 security. And there are several vendors out there that already make these. And what would happen is enforcement would own the thumb drive, would have to purge it, and have a blank file to be put into the ELD to transfer the data by a USB port. That's one methodology. But a lot of security wrapped around that to protect the information. And web services and email must adhere to NIST and FIPS publication 197. A lot of buzzword stuff. But what it means is there's a predefined government standard to protect the data from public access, to protect it for privacy, and a very high, long, detailed publication. So if you looked at NIST SP 832, if you didn't have a lot of time over a weekend, you might want to jot at that, but I would recommend it. Then they have Bluetooth, and that has to be discoverable, and it has to be able to generate random codes so that there's high level of security between USB. Personally, I'm not sure how well that would be able to be handled because you'd have to have Bluetooth capable within the cruisers or within phones to our devices. And it's not that we don't have Bluetooth capability in some of our product, but it exists. Certification process. So it's still self-certification, but over the last several months, there's been 2 publications, and what they are is it's Information Paperwork Reduction Act that FMCSA is by law is required to publish in the Federal Register. So it goes back to repeat, we still must register on FMCSA portal and receive the registration. We must display this registration and the version of our software so that enforcement can see that we are formally registered, customers can understand that we're registered, and be able to take care of that way. So in there, they also define that we need to supply 15 documents to register, a specific form describing these products that they have. They have not published that form yet, but it's defined. And there's a process that they define this time in the Federal Register release that when we update or make modifications to the product about a re-registration process. So there was an ICR issued and comments were due by May 4th. there wasn't a lot to comment on because of the way it was defined. Some suggestions may have been that they give us a copy of the ERODS application so we can verify and test that all the data has the integrity it needs to transfer into enforcement. So that's some of what I'm saying here. The standards group with third-party certification, that's not going to happen in the short term. And supplying that application makes it a lot easier to ensure that everything and all the changes we may have to make would be taken care of. Supplying the instruction card for enforcement, that was one thing that was missing, and that was a suggestion that was made. But by any rule, we have to supply that card anyway. So it won't be an imposition or a shortcoming if they don't define that document to be able to be there. Some additional key regulations, and I just want to enhance some of this, but the prohibition of coercion is past the comment period at this time. But it defines the carrier, broker, and shipper in there, and if there was finding that there was coercion of the driver to falsify logs or do something inappropriate with the logs, that there could be an $11,000 civil penalty. And if there was some dismissal involved in this whole process, and it went to a labor discussion, that there was a significant amount of punitive damages potential and loss of pay and time repaid. And that went through an NPRM process. That's what process it's in right now. It's not the final regulation, but that's where I said earlier it needs to come out with the ELD mandate. I hit the Paperwork Reduction Act. We did that. There's additional guidances on AOBRD to harmonize new and old. They'll be publishing some of those over the next, we were informed at CVSA, maybe 60 to 90 days. And I believe that's going to be more of a, okay, we're asking you to do all these things now on ELD mandate. You can change some things on AOBRD. They didn't give us a list of what they would be, but they told us that they'll be forthcoming. So one thing I've added to was talking about, you're talking to owner-operators or drivers. It's pretty much a similar communication. And I was on a Dave Nemo talk show several years ago, and a lot of pushback. I was on it a year and a half later, and the acceptance of these things was a night and day, much higher level of acceptance. And basically some of the things I'm putting here are things that we've experienced from our customers, and I've experienced talking directly to drivers. But it really reduces the risk of violations, all right? If it's used as designed, it can almost eliminate some. One of the major and the most common is a form and manner violation. And if you went to the FMCSA webpage where they keep these statistics, you can see for the last 3 or 4 years, it was the majority of the violations, as well as missing log documents, as well as logs not even in existence. But when you do an ELD, you're almost eliminating, and I'll never say 100%, but you're almost eliminating 90 to 95% potential of these form and manner violations. And the fact that you have the device and you're recording all the information eliminates those out-of-service occurrences when you might not have a missing page of a log, or maybe the log is not available on paper. So that's fairly significant. Really, drivers come back and say it gives back productivity. Some of the things we've identified on ELD facts with some white papers and some blog postings is, you can possibly save 6 hours a month in time that you would spend on just generating paper. Minimizes risk of large equipment maintenance. When you get this, you really, it's also a DVR. All our products have the DVR with it, and part of a byproduct of having an ELD. And having advance notice of failures or defects, helps that maintenance basic within the CSA scores. It really provides a platform for the driver to have extra benefits, because depending on, smartphone, tablets, different ways, there's a lot of benefits. And I think there was a report that just came out with CCJ over the last week that indicated the benefits to drivers of having the ability to have some additional applications, and it also applied to some driver retention. So I just want to repeat here, we have our ELD mandate webpage launched. We've posted white papers, and we've already posted a good number of blogs and information, and we've carved it out into, small bites so that you can look at the specific topics and see some detailed information on what's in this ELD mandate, what the benefits are, things you might want to consider, those type of opportunities. And I think there's quite a bit of good information, and we'll keep posting to this ELD facts all the way through the mandate release, and then we'll also address later. So thanks very much for listening and attention, and is there any questions that we can deal with?
All right, thank you very much, Tom. We're now going to answer everyone's questions that have been submitted. We'll get to as many as we can in the time that remains. So the first one that came through is, could you explain how the work time extensions, big day, adverse conditions, for example, should be used?
All right, I'll answer that in it's more general hours of service question than even an ELD mandate. But work time extensions, if you look at things like people call it the 16-hour big day or the 16-hour short haul exemption, when you're using that, the requirements of it are that you have to return to the reporting location the day of the use of the 16-hour big day, and you have to, in the 5 previous days, started and returned at the same location. So basically, interpreting it for 6 days, you have to come and go from the same location. What it is if you run into a situation where you need more time to return to the home terminal, and you're running out of duty time because of stops, but you have plenty of drive time left, it gives you up to 2 hours to return to the home terminal. And you must return to the home terminal, take advantage of a 16-hour big day. Right? It does not extend any drive time. You can only use it once every 7 days. And you must be dismissed by that 16th hour. So that's the 16-hour big day discussion. The other one, when you talk about adverse conditions, what that really says is that if you are running out of drive time, it will give you up to 2 hours to get to safe haven. And you got to be careful of that, because what it really means is you have up to that amount of time. If you can get to a location quicker than that 2 hours, that's really what needs to happen. The one thing that, if you look at the guidances and you understand it, if the situation is such for adverse conditions, and it was forecasted that that adverse condition was in effect, there's going to be an 18-inch snowstorm in, I don't know, Casper, Wyoming, let's call it, and you knew it was going to be there, and you still went to Casper, Wyoming and tried to get adverse conditions, might be interpreted incorrectly. So be cautious on using adverse conditions. There are many weather conditions where tornadoes pop up or really heavy thunderstorms come in and people didn't expect them, and they're very valid to use adverse conditions for that. But be careful if the situation was forecasted or it was pre-known that the situation could happen.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And here's another question. Will an ELD automatically record drive time?
An ELD must, that's the one thing that it has to do automatically. It must record drive time being integrated within the vehicle, meaning the way it's done typically is you have speed sensors within the vehicle, and that captures the motion. So that's where drive time has to be automatic.
Thank you. And if you have an owner-operator driving under your authority, who pays for the ELD?
Well, we're getting into some IRS rules. You know, if it's an owner-operator, that's an independent contractor, right? So that when you talk about that, and I'm not going to claim I know every little detail in the IRS, but there's an arm's length approach from my carrier days that you must maintain, and you cannot supply services without some remuneration, or they may be considered an employee. So, you know, that in general terms is the best answer I could probably give for that right now.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Now, this question is, will drivers who fall under the short haul exemption and only log when they don't meet the requirements be required to use electronic logs?
There's a bunch of wording in the preamble on that. It doesn't say that emphatically they have to, but within our own products, we're in the process of taking care of that, where in case you're on a short haul for 4 days and you go over and need a 16-hour big day that requires record of duty status, or you're going to break the 100-mile air rule, or you're going to not be able to return in time for 12-hour duty time, some of the criteria that comes under a short haul exemption, we automatically kick you over into record of duty status. That, I think, by anybody's standards, is a benefit, because you don't have to worry about the paper for those days. Now, and it doesn't address specifically within ELD SNPRM how they can do that. It doesn't say that you can't, but you must keep record of duty status for those days that you break the short haul exemption. But it does not say you have to have an ELD. But we've taken the approach in our product line to be able to give that option so that you don't have to worry about keeping all those extra papers and the cost to maintain that for 6 months.
Thank you. And we got a couple questions on how do accidents affect adverse conditions rule on the E-log?
They don't typically call out accidents. And so that would be an interpretation discussion. But if an accident was occurred, there's comments you can make as to the extenuating circumstances. I would suggest that you don't do that while you're driving, obviously, because we won't allow that while the vehicle's in motion. But there is that with the new ELD mandate, all right, it's saying that if you are stopped for up to 5 minutes, that we can put you into an on-duty status to give you time to make that comment. But it doesn't eliminate it, you know, because sometimes when you read these regulations, you have to understand what it says and what it doesn't say. And it doesn't say that an accident could not be used for an adverse condition. But again, I wouldn't give you a black and white interpretation on that.
Thank you, Tom. Now, what happens if there are trucks in your fleet that are too old and do not have the ECM for the relay to log properly?
Well, that's a difficulty in the SNPRM. It was called out. Because in the SNPRM they've defined many more fields, and I don't mean 20. They define 3 or 4 or 5 more fields that you have to capture with these duty status change, like engine hours and ignition on, ignition off, and things of that nature. But they do not have an answer right now for vehicles that are older than, call it 95 or 96, when electronic control modules were not in the engine. So they're still looking for comments. I believe they'll address that in a final rule. But again, there's not a hard and fast answer for that.
Thank you, Tom. This question is it 100% certain that ELD will be mandatory for all drivers with HOS duty status, including one truck owner ops?
Well, there's a general, I would say there's a general statement that any vehicle or driver that's required to keep record of duty status now would be required to have electronic logging device. So if you're required to keep RODS now, it doesn't single out whether you're a single owner operator, whether you're a 5-truck fleet, a 4-truck owner operator fleet, or a 1,000 vehicle fleet.
Thank you. And how will rental vehicles be addressed?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been asked that question many times. They don't specifically call out rental vehicles, but I would suggest that depending on the term of the vehicle, you know, if you're keeping it for a week, you know, that you probably a week, or some carriers have seasonal rentals of 2 or 3 months, that they would probably suggest that some electronic logging device be available. Again, there is not a hard and fast definition on that within that, and they've talked about some drive-away vehicles also. So there's not any definition for rental vehicles. I was asked that, I think, 2 weeks ago or 3 or 4 weeks ago at TCA also.
Great, thank you. How will network or device failures or issues be handled by law enforcement? Okay, I'm going to answer it in 2 ways, whether the network failure is due to enforcement's issue or the network failure is due to AT&T or some Sprint or Verizon or some carrier going down. If it's from the enforcement side, there's other vehicles that I believe we would satisfy, whether you want a USB drive and be able to transfer it that way, or email it if our network was available that was in a device. There is remedies that they talk about for failures and on how much duration of time and this kind of thing. And what you must also remember is what they haven't changed in some of the regulations are that if a device fails, there still has to be a blank logbook within the vehicle, so that if there was something happening, some catastrophic, you know, network failure in an area, that's at the point in time when this blank logbook would come into play. We have not experienced catastrophic network failures. I mean, I've been doing wireless for a significant amount of years. I've seen systems, particular systems, have issues, but I've not seen lengthy failures occur. Okay, thank you, Tom. This question is there any consideration of some type of exemption for when a vehicle is just moved to a loading dock during off hours of the driver?
Well, I would suggest that because they're defining yard moves, as long as you qualify that that was a yard movement, that the driver would have an event called a yard move that says, if I put the vehicle into a yard move, all right, I'm only capturing on-duty time. You still have to capture duty status, but it's on duty, it's not drive. So I believe FMCSA understands that those occurrences happen, because if you look at the current regulation, you would be counting that as drive time. But under the ELD mandate, they instituted a yard movement.
Thank you, Tom. And this question is just about transferring from paper log to e-log. Will drivers have to post this prior to 7 hours into the e-log?
Well, I don't see that it says anything different than it did before, that says that if you were going from one location to another, if you were doing part-time in one, part-time in another, you'd have to keep some document available, because you still have to produce 8 days of logs. I don't see where you would have to enter all 7 or 8 days or 6 days, as long as you had the availability to produce 8 days of logs. I'll relook, but I don't see any information in that short 168 pages that said that.
Thank you, Tom. Can you please discuss short haul options? Will there be changes to address rules for short haul?
Can you repeat that, please?
I'm sorry. Will there be changes to address the rules for short haul options?
There's nothing in the regulation that I saw that would make any changes to short haul. Remember, the short haul exemption is part of hours of service. It's not part of an ELD mandate. In the preamble, they suggested some things on short haul, using using logs more than 8 days in a 30-day period, but that was just a comment. That was not a change to short haul. The short haul is dictated by hours of service, right? It's in the definitions, and it's within the 395.3 regulation. So I don't see any changes to short haul exemptions.
Thank you. And this person was looking for clarification on, will the ELD need to be registered with the FMCSA to ensure that it is compliant? Will this be something that the trucking company must do, or will our telematics provider take care of this?
Now, we as a supplier of ELDs are required to register the device with FMCSA with 15 documents as they're defined in the last ICR Information Collection Paperwork Reduction Act stuff. We would be required to get the registration number back from FMCSA and display that within the ELD so that you and enforcement would know that this device is registered with FMCSA as a valid ELD.
Thank you, Tom. This question is, will local police have to request a DOT officer on any stops within their jurisdiction?
I can't really comment on that. I will say this, right? There's about 12,500 DOT trained inspectors in the United States. There are other state police that have been trained on commercial vehicle stops. If the local enforcement, which some have, I believe Pittsburgh as an example, probably has 5 or 6 police officers that are certified to do CMV stops. But as far as saying that if any local police officer stops some CMV, do they have to have a DOT person there? I would say that there is nothing defined as a pure requirement for that.
Thank you, Tom. And we have time for one more question here, and that is, will drivers who fall under the short haul exemption and only log when they don't meet the requirements be required to use electronic logs?
Right. I think we had that question earlier, but just to repeat and hope I'm clear, is that there's nothing in there that says that you have to have an ELD for those days that the exemption is broken. Again, I would repeat that we have taken a position that in our product lines that we supply functionality that will allow you to run short haul on your telematics device and be able to kick over into electronic logs for the days you break the exemption. Makes it a lot easier on the driver and the carrier. But as far as very specific saying that you have to have an ELD for the days you break, that's not in the regulation that I have seen.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm going to answer this one last question myself, which is, will there be more webinars as we get closer to September? And that answer is yes. You can keep up on that with eldfacts.com. So please keep that in mind. Thank you again, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining today. We got a lot of questions, and we will be following up with you offline if we weren't able to get to it live. So thank you again. Check out eldfacts.com and enjoy the rest of your day.